The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. This is Mike Trumper at Tabor Institute with one of our regular webinars that we provide. Today's webinar is going to be how to use the results of your project risk analysis. In the past, we've been sort of getting down in the weeds for a while, and we've decided that we're going to bring it back and start to produce some more, I would say, novice or intermediate level webinars and content, just so that we can bring it up and become more relevant to some of our newer users. In today, we're going to take a quick look at a risk and running a simulation and what the outputs are, how to interpret them, and then what we might do with those results, where to look for in terms of, especially when you run a simulation for the first time in your project. A lot of times the results look quite ghastly. If you looking at that, you realize that something has to be done, or your project's going to be over budget or schedule, run longer than anticipated. So where do you look for in the results of the simulation to be look at points where you might be having some optimization? We're not going to go into how to optimize, because that's completely different for every single project, but we'll show in the analysis how it highlights areas within your project where you can look to where you should look to optimize your project plan based on the results of the simulations. Before we get going, though, I'm just going to go over some of the oh, we've got some animation in here. Here we go, just about how can you participate. So hopefully you're already set up on your audio and visual. Again, I always recommend using your computer mic and speakers rather than phoning in. The quality is always a little bit better. If you look down, there is a pane that you should see. It says questions. Now, you can ask questions if it has something to do with the quality, you're having trouble hearing me, or something else is going on that needs to be addressed. We'll try and address that right away. Other than that, we will answer the questions in the order they come in at the end of the webinar. Typically, we don't see a lot of questions. I'm hoping that this webinar will run about 35 minutes. So you hold on. Looks like we have a fairly good crowd today, some familiar names. So hello. So let's get started. I'm just going to do a quick, I'm not going to spend too many times on the slide deck because it doesn't really, there is, if you signed up, you might have seen the little video that we had. So you see what we're looking at doing. We're going to take a look at one of the sample files that we have that comes with the software. So if you've installed the software and you go to wherever you've installed, you'll see samples, and in there we have various files in there that have different ways of modeling risk in the system. We're going to be using one of those. It's called the drilling one, and we're just going to go over how that's been modeled in the system, all the different components that you can use using what we call uncertainty and risk events, one being unmanageable and one being manageable. And we'll take a look at the statistical results. So those are the raw results that are coming out, how you can interpret them, what do they mean to you, and then we'll look for indications. We're going to say indication for what are these results telling you about where you should be looking in your project, where in your project are the critical or crucial tasks or critical risks, And those are the ones that you want to look at first to be able to optimize your schedule to bring you sort of make it a much more, I'm going to say, doable, or you can bring your performance into where you want it. And then we'll look at, and we'll talk about this as we're going through, about risk-adjusted contingency and margins. You probably, if you've sat in any of these or you've looked in our website, we talk about this as being what we call realistic contingency and margins to protect your project deliverable. So how much contingency and margin do you need to put in based on the level of risk that your system has, your project has, to be able to protect your deliverable, either dates or budget. So we'll take a quick look at that, and like I said, maybe half an hour. We run on a bit longer, so be it. So I'm just going to switch over to the schedule. So again, you look up here, I've just called it an example. I've just renamed it because I did some changes to the actual base one. But it is this what we're using as a basis, RP drilling, and that's from the sample files that we have in the system. And if we wanted to take a look at that, just so you know that these are there. A lot of people don't realize those are there. We'll look in here, and here's our samples, and this would be the file. So all of these different files here, if you're ever looking for examples about how things can be modeled in your project, we do have all of these sample files available. Now, as might be suspected, so we brought in, and it's a schedule with the precedent network. We see the predecessors, and they have resources. So those resources are all listed here. And one of the things that we're going to be doing, this is actually not just a schedule risk analysis, it's an integrated cost and schedule. And we are going to be actually running the cost analysis based on the resource rates. And you can see them right here. The only one that actually won't be risked in this one is the fracking, because it's a material. It's based on units, and that hasn't been, we haven't risked that in this one. But all of these ones will be risked based on the schedule. So if it runs longer, we're going to be having more days, and we're going to be consuming more budget. If you wanted to, you could bring in fixed costs, and what those are not, we say, time independent costs. They're not dependent upon the schedule. So sometimes material costs will bring in there, and you can put them in here, and you could risk them as well. We don't have it in this file, but it is a possibility if you're going to run an integrated cost and schedule risk analysis. And what we're seeing right here is just, this is our resource cost, and it all automatically just calculates that. The other side of that, if we go back in, is that we have uncertainty on the schedule. And I hope that you can see this on here. I've used risk bands, and risk bands are available up here, and we can set them. And these are basically setting levels of uncertainty that you believe are on particular activities. These are sort of random. I would say this is probably a routine activities might have this much variance. If you're in an R&D, something where you have very little knowledge of the activities that you're going to have, a lot of times the uncertainty around that, rather than risks, is going to be quite high. And this would be actually quite low on some of those. We see that the high coefficient, we've had it, it's here 1.8, could be up to 3. And the low one could be lower, but these can be all set up if you want to do a quick way of showing it on the screen and selecting that. And what I've done here, and the way to do that here is just going in here and selecting that. So if I wanted to, I'll give that green. So this is sort of random, but it's just adding some uncertainty so we can see how that applies. We still have the older method that we had. So if you want to add in your coefficients manually, you can do that as well. And we could add 0.8, and we can say 1.4 or 5 or something along there, and give a distribution, a statistical distribution type. And that will recalculate based on those coefficients. So we've added that. The other side of that is we've added risks. And this system has risks in here. We have these 5, 6, 7 risks. I just wanted to mention the one, this is an older file. And typically now we would say you can model that using a weather calendar that we've added in version 7.0 3 or 4 years back. But all of these risks have been added in, and they are actually quite realistic to the type of project this is. And you can see how they've been assigned, which they've all been assigned to 5, and if we wanted to, we could actually see what those are. A better way with a new view that we have is the risk assignment view. So if you want to take a look at how all the risks have been assigned to the activity, we can take a look at here. And here's our risks. And here are the assignments, and it's showing this risk has been assigned to this task. It's with its ID. It could be a resource or task. With the probability, we call it chance. With the outcome type is a chance, a 20% chance of a relative delay, so it will expand by between 15 to 20%. It's a triangular distribution. The rest of these have a uniform distribution. Mostly in this one, it's fairly simple. Uniform distribution. We could go in if we wanted to within the risk assignment view. We cannot add new assignments just because of the way the modeling works, but we can modify them. There's a risk assignment information if we wanted to look at see where it's assigned. It'll just show us on the schedule where that risk assignment is. We put in a description about that risk, and we can actually correlation. We can see how it's correlated. So this risk is correlated with all the other instances of this risk in the system. We can also, if we wanted to modify the risk assignment, we can go to let's go here. So right now this is triangular. If we wanted to change some of the parameters, beta pert is one that's a little bit is popular. We can change, typically on beta pert, we're just going to change where the mean is. Log normal. Another one, and it has a few more parameters that we can set up in there. But we'll leave this at triangular for now, but I'm just showing you that we can change those. So we've set up within the system, we've set up our risks, and these represent manageable risk or reducible risks in the system, and we've set up 3-point estimates, which are, we're using that a separate sort of bucket to manage unmanageable risk. We can't, in this type of risk that we see here is, it's going to occur, it's 100%. We can't change the probability of occurring it. So all we can do is account for it. Now, once we've done that, we're going to set up one of the things that we want to do, and we've added with version 7.1 is schedule diagnostics. This is a fairly standard, very simple one. It's based on what's called the DCMA 14-point schedule assessment. With DCMAs, the Defense Contractors Management Agency out of the U.S. federal government, and it has just become a sort of a standard basic schedule diagnostics. The reason we want to run it is that we have to look at certain things when we run the Monte Carlo simulation to make sure that it's valid. Things that will stop it from being valid is missing logic. Now we do have some here, and we can see the results here. They're all missing. And this is just because as each one of these wells gets connected, they're not linked on it. So we're not really worried about that. But we'd want to look at missing logic. We don't want to have dangling activities. Each activity should, unless it's like these, should have a predecessor and a successor, so that any updates on the precedent network are felt or pushed down the precedent network. Otherwise, you can have an activity that runs extremely late, but if it's not linked in properly, that effect will not be seen on what should be its successors or at the project level. The other ones we want to look at is relationship types and logic. Sometimes the relationship types are, we might have out of sequence tasks. So where a predecessor starts before the successor. And the last one, which is hard constraints, and we do see these a lot, unless the only hard constraints that sort of get a pass are when you have actuals. It's once that activity started, if you're in the middle of a project and it started, those actuals, they're hard, we can't move those. That's not part of the simulation. So you'll see those sometimes. But other than that, you want to remove as many hard constraints as possible, because what they do will they will actually make your analysis invalid. Generally, it'll make it look much more optimistic than it's supposed to, because like with missing logic, it will not push out. It will set those in and probably make things look a lot more optimistic, because you've put in something it must start on. Well, if the successors haven't been finished yet, that must start on isn't valid, really, if there's a finished start on those. And a lot of times we'll see a lot of hard people when they're doing project planning, they have some ideas in their head that, we have to, in order to get this done by a certain time, this has to be started by then. And that's really not what the simulation's about. We're actually saying if things get delivered late or finished late, how is that going to impact all the other activities that are going to be linked to that? So we want to get rid of the hard constraints. So a lot of these other ones, I don't really, that's part of the DCMA about what they want to do in terms of their schedule quality. If you want to use them, you can use them. We don't. It's it's not a hard recommendation for us. We're really worried about schedule logic, relationship types, hard constraints, etc. So we can run that. We can see that this is actually going to be a valid schedule that we can run on. There doesn't look to be any problems. The other thing we want to look at is the calculation options. The first thing is number of parameters. It's a Monte Carlo parameter. How many, should say iterations. I'm going to run 1,000 iterations during the simulation. I'm going to turn off the convergence monitoring. We call the convergence monitoring is the good enough based on these parameters that we can set here. We do monitor the changes in mean and standard deviation during an simulation. If you have a extremely large project with lots of resources and risks and everything, a lot of times if you just want to get the good enough simulation, you can actually set this up. This one with the default parameters, I normally see a schedule. It'll converge, it'll meet these parameters and stop the simulation at between 350 and 500 iterations. Okay, so we're going to set this at 1,000. The other thing is we want to look at, and this is how we're going to set up. What I want to look at is the risk-adjusted margin and cost contingency. So when we run the simulation, a lot of times we get a little confusion. What does this mean? When we run a simulation, when we see in the results, we see something labeled as low or high, whether that's cost, finish time, or duration, start time. There's some other ones. This tells us what this is, and this is P80. So what that means when we say P80, that means in our world, P80 means that 8 out of 10 times the cost will be at or below that. So it's not that it's 80% chance that it will be that, or P80 that it will be that. It's that it will be at that or below. So the cost could be anywhere, and we can see when you look at histograms, you can sort of get a better idea about what that distribution is, but it's 80% chance at or below. So when we set at P80, it's a fairly, the confidence level is fairly high, it would be considered, or it'd be considered conservative. The higher that number is, the more conservative, the less risk that you're taking on. So if you're in a startup, let's say you're a new company that's wanting to develop a vaccine for the COVID virus, and you need to get it to market as quick, you might be willing to take on, because if you're able to do it in a timely fashion, your confidence level might be lower. You might set that to 70 or 60. Your smaller companies that are startups tend to be much more aggressive, have a lot bigger risk appetite. The bigger the companies, more established, they tend to have they have lower risk tolerance, and they set the confidence level higher. So it really depends where you want to. But again, and P80 is pretty well a standard that we see. It's somewhere between P70 and P80 is normally what we see. So once we've done that, we can just run a quick calculation. And we've seen that. And the first thing we're going to go and take a look at is the result Gantt. Result Gantt is showing us, it's a nice little visualization of the amount of risk the risk in the system. I'm just going to simplify this because we're seeing and what we can see here, I hope you can see this, I'll pick one out that's a bit better, is the white bar is our original, that's our current, it's called current schedule in our sort of lexicon, and these are the results of that. We can start to see how it's starting to slide based on risks and uncertainties in the system. If we want to see what risks are in there, we can actually click on that and show those risks. And this is the original deterministic, and this is the mean results. So not P50, but the mean, the average results of that are showing there. If we wanted to see the low, we could see that here, a little less risk there. And if we wanted to see the high, which is our P80, which is right here. So that does give us a good idea already within, not too far. We're starting to see quite a slide in the schedule between that. So this is our risk adjusted. Now, one of the things that we can do with a risk adjusted schedule is we can export it out as an XML or an MPX. We could actually export it out as an XML, an Excel with all the precedents and resources, etc. If you can set that up in here, and you could export it out as an Excel spreadsheet. Sorry, here we go. And this, you could take all the data out of the grid and export it out. What we'd want to do here is, I'll just show you what happens when we do. I'm just going to call it test. It'll probably say there's already one. The deterministic schedule, typically we're not going to do that unless we run. But we might say, okay, well, we're going to put it out as our base. So that would be the mean of our results. Or we could export it out as results based of the analysis, or a specific one. So we might say, high results here again would be, as we set P80, we might want to put it down to P50, which means we have a 50-50 chance of meeting that date, which might be a very good internal target, as opposed to delivery dates. You're going to have a more aggressive internal date that you're going for. So you can export those results out of here. And if we actually double click on any of these bars, we can actually see the results for any of these activities here. The other part that we want to take a look at is the project summary. Project summary at a very high level, we can start to look at and we can say what's the difference between the cost. So right now we can see that we have about $1.4 million of cost risk at the P80 level, if we're looking at that. So if we are looking at cost contingency right now, if we wanted to make sure that we have a high confidence level of delivering on budget, we'd probably have to put in around $1.4 million of cost contingency on there. And we also see that on the duration or the finish time. We have about 3 weeks of calendar dates in terms of how much buffer or margin that we want to put at the project level. Typically, we're not going to put it at the project level, so I'll show some ways that we can extract particular values that we might want to put in our management schedule to put in margin and contingency. So when we look at this, one of the things we want to take a look at is a detail schedule. Before we just take a look at what this means to us, you can do a little bit of modifications that will help you to interpret what you're seeing. I do like to create a little bit of a wider than our default. I put some gaps. I just think it looks cleaner. I'm going to include the slider. If I turn that off, the slider is a nice little, if you're actually looking on the live screen, it allows you to sort of drag across and see what your chances are. I'm not really all that interested in looking at the low results, but I'm going to include the P80, which is our default high, and I'm going to include the deterministic so we can see on that. And if we wanted to, we could include that, and it would show these on the smaller chart. We'll go there. So what are we looking at here? So first of all, you can see the gap between the deterministic, and we're looking at the deterministic, and if we look at the Cume prob here, this is showing us the chance. It's telling us some bad news. So we have a 0% chance of meeting that. So really, we're going to have to look for some ways to optimize this. And this, again, we've got this marked out over here. Here's our P80. So this gap is really the budget contingency that we would need to protect. We would have to have a budget of $18.85 million to be able to deliver on budget and maybe make a profit out of it as well. So again, a big gap there that we want to. The other thing that I like to look at is that a lot of people are surprised when they don't see. They're used to seeing a histogram. So the green bars here are this histogram. They're used to seeing a nice even, a sort of a triangular or log normal. And if we actually drew a line here, it would probably look, very much like a log normal sort of curve. But one of the things you can see in here is that in reality, we have one distribution, two distributions. We might have three distributions here, and then we have a few more. And what's this telling? This is really typical where we have risks in the system are major drivers for in our project. So right here, this represents to me that there's a big risk event occurring that's driving this little sort of distribution we hear, and quite possibly there's another one here that's sort of pushed this out here, because typically you might see it go like this, but there might be one that's overlapping that. And there's a few other sort of, it looks like little risk events that are occurring, but they're very, very minor. If we drag this over and say, what's, how much are they? These are, 2, 3 standard deviations outside of where we're looking at. So really, it's this sort of piece right here is that we want to find out what's driving that, and maybe minimize it as much as possible so that we can sort of push this out this way. So just from looking at this, I can say, okay, well, and you can see this again here. I mean, this is, again, we have one, and then we have, and I've heard it called multimodal or bimodal or polymodal sort of histograms, where you're seeing these risk events and you don't get this. And these risk events are really driving some of this, driving some of the project results out to the right. So the next stage of that is we're going to look at the sensitivity analysis. And most of us are worried about cost. And in this case, because resources are driving costs, there's not a lot of difference between the schedule drivers and the cost drivers. So we can just simplify it by looking at this. And this is telling us pretty strongly that this gamma ray test is a major driver in here. And we do see some drilling that's coming down, but really anything that's associated with this gamma ray test, we can see the task IDs here. If we wanted to, we could, again, using the Microsoft Project Excel, if we wanted to export that out, we could export this out as a, there we go. We could export this out as a Excel spreadsheet, or we could just print it out as a, here we go. We'll just go to print preview and we could show that. And then we could pass that on to our project managers or the CAMs or the controllers, who's ever in charge of these, to start taking a look at what's causing that. And we can, just because I've got a fairly good idea, we can understand, well, what's probably causing it, because we saw those risk events. We saw some risks, so there are probably some risks that are associated with that. And we could take a look at that, but I want to go into the risk register. So this is, we rank, if we wanted to. Let me just go back here and we'll just say risks. And we can see actually this risk is driving these. But another way to look at that is the crucial tasks, again, and it's telling us the same thing. that we're seeing on the sensitivity. So this is what this has done, is it's taken that sensitivity analysis and it's actually plotted it on a Gantt chart. So it highlights those areas that we have the most amount of risk and should be identified for further investigation about how we can start to minimize the amount of risk on there. So you can see here, and this is the sensitivity to duration. So one of the things it's interesting about the gamma ray test is that it doesn't have, it obviously it's causing some sensitivity around the duration, but it does have a very big cost impact on this. We see this on, if we go down on the drilling, has both. And we can see how these are shown on the Gantt chart here. So it's a nice visualization. You want to come in and say, here's the traffic light sort of model, red, yellow, and green. So these would be the activities that we're going to take a look at first, and then start to look at these yellow ones. And depending on whether you're cost or schedule sensitive, or both, in this case, you might focus on one or the other. But it does give the same sort of assessment and ability to identify where you might be looking to optimize as the sensitivity analysis does, the view does. So once we looked at that, we do know the risks are the major part of that. We're going to look at the risk register, and as we suspected, the gamma ray job. So we have this, and we have a delay in drilling. So a fairly simple risk register. I realize that a lot of risk registers are going to be much larger, but it does allow you to sort. So we have it to sort. It's automatically, if we have this set up, we're automatically going to be sorting on the risk score. And the risk score is really based on the same sort of statistical sensitivity analysis used in the sensitivity analysis and the crucial tasks. And it's applied on the risk scores. So it's all very interrelated. And we just normalize the score, but we could actually, if we wanted to, we could take a look at and see, we can slice and dice this based on various categories that we have. We want to see how their risk score based on cost. We wanted to look at finish time, what's driving, and the combined, this when we don't have any hierarchy on there, we're looking at the overall impact. So one of the things is when we looked at doing some optimization, I'm going to look at this gamma ray one, and I've done a little bit of analysis on this. So when we're looking at the risk, one of the things we can do an auto calculation of expected cost loss. So we want to look at the loss of the risk. So if that risk occurs, it could cost around $2 million overall. It's got an overall impact of $2 million when that risk. Expected loss is the potential loss times the probability. So we have an expected loss of $500,000. So what we've done in place is we put in a couple plans that we're going to reduce the risk. And typically we're going to be able to reduce the probability. And we can start to see what the costs are. And we can see the pre and post mitigation. These are slightly out of sync, unfortunately, because I've done some modifications to the risk matrix, so it's not a standard risk matrix. But we can see the pre and post mitigation. I've actually put in just to take a look at that, I've actually got another plan that we might put in place. So right now, we saw that actually, let me just remove this. We'll go back. And we can see that this actually looks to be making sense. So we're going to save $43,000 with these mitigation plans in place. So yeah, we'll probably that makes sense on the cost benefit. Let's see, we can add another one. So here's here we go. So I've got these mitigation plans. They've been added here. I'll just quickly show those. And we're going to say that this is actually going to bring it down to 5%. We still haven't, it's still, if it occurs, it's still going to have the same impact. But we brought the risk score down to here, but it costs $125,000. So how does that work? So we're looking at optimizing that risk. And we can actually see if we put that one in play, it's going to save us even more money by dropping that probability down. So really that makes sense, and we can actually play around with that. It may make sense if we did, is actually to drop this one. And it might save us $25,000 on the overall impact of the risk. I don't know, but it does allow you to do some optimization around your risk planning. Take a quick look at what it looks like for our expected savings or losses, and build up what we think is the best risk plans around there. So once we've done that, I'm not going to, if you've sat in any of our other webinars, and we do have it up on, we have a ways to do scenario analysis, and scenario analysis would be taking in those risk optimization plans, building them into the schedule, and running these alternative scenarios of risk planning. This is the very simplest way to do it. In this case, you could just go in here and we could add these 3 risk plans, mitigation activities with finish times and costs. We could add them to the project plan and reduce the risk, and we should get a fairly good idea about what the optimization will bring us. Once we've done all of our optimization, though, I'm just going to go back in and calculate this. I'm going to go in and I'm going to go into the report. Now, this is one of my, this is an older report built into the system way back when we first released it in 2004. But I found more and more use for it. One of the things, so I set it up and I like to use this to create a quick report that data that I can use actually to calculate, that will allow me to sort of say what are the contingency and margins that we might want to be putting into our project plan. So what I've done is I've gone to, if you go to reports, you can go to simulation results. And here I've just added this one. I don't really, just because it's there. But I'm taking the base duration versus the high duration. And this is actually running, when it's behind the scenes, I have to take a look at it, but it's putting it out as 8-hour days. The reality is it's a 24-hour schedule on the program, so we'd have to do a little bit of manipulation on there. But that's why those results look a little bit odd compared to the finish times. And so we can see the finish time here. Again, it looks like we've got about 2 to 3 weeks of calendar days of schedule margin that we would have overall. But actually, if you look down, once we do it, we can start to see it down here and down here for the margin. We can start to pull out at every level here. And the same with the cost. So if we wanted to see how much contingency we might have on this particular activity, we can take the original cost and take that away from the cost high, and we would get our contingency. The next step in this would be to export this out, and you just can kind of click on one of these things, and just to let the application know that you're looking at this view, and you go to Microsoft Excel, and you can export all of this out as an Excel spreadsheet. Now, I've already done that, and I've simplified it a little bit. We can export that out. I added on this particular one, you can just see I've added a margin. I've converted these into sort of 24-hour days for the purposes. So what I've done is I've taken the E2, E2 minus this date, divide by 3. And so I'm getting 20 days of margin here at each one. So I've got the level of margin required. So this is at the project level, and here's at the smaller, you might call them WBS levels, or when completion dates on the wells. And you could do the same with cost. So I haven't done this I've done the same on the contingency here as well. So if we wanted to, you set aside so much contingency, and once that's completed, you can retire whatever contingency is left over. And so this allows us to give us a quick idea about how much risk adjusted, so realistic, and it's based on the actual level of risk in the system that you would need to, we call it protecting your project deliverable dates and budget. Just to finish off, when we talk about realistic, and I have this conversation with people quite a bit, as opposed to sort of a standard what might have been that we're going to put on 10% of a budget for contingency, which is the problem with that is that based on the level of risk, if you have a lot of risk in your system, that 10% probably won't be enough. In fact, it won't be enough. if it is a very routine activity where where you don't have a lot of risks, you've done something like building houses on developers where a lot of times the uh, um, there's not a lot of risk, fairly routine activities. Other than that, if people get delayed, um, that 10% works pretty well. Or it could be too much on a very routine activity. Sometimes you're sort of over, you're uh, you're giving yourself way too much. And the problem with that is that means that money still, you don't need that much money. That money still has to be put away on the side just to cover that amount, just in case. On big projects with large budget, that can be uh, a real issue in terms of being able to, because that money's set aside or should be, that you can't be used for other purposes. So we want to make sure that we have the most efficient use of resources in terms of schedule and costs, and using a risk-adjusted method, we believe gives you the best method of making sure that you have enough and you're going to deliver on time and on budget without over allocating funds to cover that risk. So with that, I'm just trying to take a look into our questions, and I think I can see at least one. There might be more. It seems to be a little bit, oh, we've got lots of questions here. Okay, so I'll go through the questions as they came in. So, oh, has audio started? Hopefully everyone can hear something. I did not see those coming in, I'm sorry. It's got on mine that the audio is working. Can the scheduled diagnostics, first one, be exported into Excel or similar? Yes, and I hope you saw that. With the Excel, you can actually, prior to us having the Excel export, you could just copy and paste the data into there. You can copy and paste any of the visualizations, or they can be exported to PowerPoint. So why, rather than the contingency being difference between the base estimate and the mean, is between the mean and the P60? Because the reality is if you can, I would say as part of the optimization, you might, if you can get the deterministic close to the mean, then that would make sense. But the reality is you're using your base schedule. So if your plan has very little chance of being completed on there, then you have to have more. It's the mean has got to, because a lot of that, because you haven't built in that risk. I would say is what you want to do is once you've run the first thing, do some optimize, make a more realistic schedule, maybe by exporting out the mean or the P50 to your schedule. That becomes the new baseline, and then you can put that contingency. So we're only going to do the contingency after we've and the margin once you've done this optimization. just from James Mitchell. He says, just a comment, it's hard to get estimators off to 10%. And that's really, yeah. And if you're in here, if you can bring in this idea about a risk adjusted that accounts for the amount of risk rather than just taking, and I've gotten in trouble with this, rather than taking the 10% or whatever the original is, that it's not realistic. A lot of times it's not realistic. And I gave a presentation several years back, and the guy said, well, why would we bother doing this? And he said, and I made the mistake of saying, well, how has that worked out for you? Because it actually hadn't been. The reason why management had brought us in was to help them out, is because they were not they were consistently over budget, over schedule. And part of that was to be able to bring in more realistic plans with realistic margin and contingency. Oh, hi, John. Oh, so the DCMA 14-point diagnostics, you can copy and paste it. It doesn't export out as part of the XML right now. It's a good idea. We just didn't get around, and obviously we're very, I'm going to say, iterative in our development. Once we can see once we get feedback on particular features that we have, we're always quite willing to, add that to the application. And actually, that had been brought up. We just 7.1 came out in about a year ago, and we've done some upgrades. We've been focusing a lot on our XER import, as that's becoming more of we were getting more of an audience for that. But thank you for bringing that up, and I would probably look to see that coming out either in an update or a new, when we're going to be releasing version 7.2, which looks to be in about 6 months if everything goes well. We've, like everyone else, we've had an uneven progress during the last 6 months. So if there's no more questions, I appreciate everyone showing up. If you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me directly at Intaver. And I'd be happy to, or if you have some suggestions in regards to the application, what you'd like to see, would love to hear from you guys. Thanks for your time. And I'm going to, with that, I don't see any more questions. I will call it a day. Just one last thing. Yes, we will be posting the the recording of the presentation online. Generally, it will go onto our YouTube channel as well at some point. If you want me to send it to you directly, because it's going to be a fairly big, it'll be around 80 to 100 megabytes. Let me know, but I can send you a link to the webinar recording from on our website. Thank you, and look forward to you at our next one.